American innovation. Where to begin? If you went back through history and looked at all the most important touchstones of American innovation, I think eventually you'd settle on the founding of our democracy itself. Before government, before party lines, and I'd look at Thomas Paine. He was the guy in 1776 who took it upon himself to convince everyday colonists to join the fight for American independence. He wrote a short manifesto called Common Sense. And without that simple notion, that common sense approach to what was needed, America may have never happened.
And so the age of invention was upon us.
Vast industries growing from the simplest ideas, propelling us ever forward.
These endeavors, this unfettered invention, this unswerving belief in a greater life for a greater number, ensured for the common man the highest standard of living in the history of mankind.
3, 2, 1.
Go, I don't go. Guys, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. GNC, go. Ecom, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom, we're go for landing. You're looking great. Beautiful, just beautiful.
Yes, we strive for the United States of America. And if we shall succeed, America will point the way.
Imagination, ideas, invention. It's a commonly held misconception that we're still the leaders in those things. We slowed down. Others sped up. China, South Korea, India, Brazil, Singapore. China's built 75 new airports in the last 10 years alone. The U.S. hasn't built a major airport in over 20. The U.S. no longer files the majority of patents at the U.S. Patent Office. Businesses are being started at nearly the lowest level since the U.S. Census began keeping records in the late 70s. Almost as many businesses are folding as are starting. U.S. companies are taking their businesses overseas. The question then becomes, if we're not spending our time on innovation and development like the rest of the world, what are we spending our time on? There's a lot to suggest that the answer to that is red tape. You're looking at 11.5 billion man-hours spent yearly on paperwork. We spend more time on government forms than on grocery shopping or even walking. We are still that same nation, bursting with ideas. I think we're just searching for a better way to spend less time on things like paperwork and more time on our life's work. So how about we work together? I mean, come on. We have a great hand here. Let's not blow it. It's common sense.
There are no constraints on the human mind, no walls around the human spirit, no barriers to our progress except those we ourselves erect.
Good morning and welcome. I'm Josh Bolton, President and CEO of the Business Roundtable. The video you just watched is intended to convey a message about American economic leadership, its rise throughout our history, its stumbles along the way, and its stagnation in recent years. What have been the major causes of that stagnation so far in the 21st century? In the realm of U.S. economic policy, our Business Roundtable members have long agreed that three areas stand out: tax, regulation, and infrastructure. The recent tax reform legislation is fixing a lot of the first problem, dramatically improving the competitiveness of the U.S. as a place to do business. On the second, regulation, the Trump administration has made real progress in alleviating the enormous burden that unnecessary overregulation has placed on our economy. But progress on the third leg of the competitiveness stool, infrastructure, is hard to find. In the decades following World War II, America set the gold standard in infrastructure. Our economy benefited enormously from those investments in the foundation of our economic competitiveness. Since then, however, those crucial investments in infrastructure have waned, and so has America's competitiveness. Today, America's infrastructure ranks well behind our biggest developed country competitors. Businesses, workers, and families lose billions of hours and dollars every year as they deal with the burdens of our antiquated infrastructure. And the problem is compounding every year. This morning, we're going to explore the costs of inaction. And more importantly, we're going to hear from an outstanding panel of leaders in business, labor, and government about how we can begin to rebuild America's infrastructure. From business, our panelists are Jamie Dimon, Chairman and CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, and our chairman here at Business Roundtable. Brendan Bechtel, Chairman and CEO of Bechtel Group, the world's largest engineering and construction firm. From labor, we're delighted to be joined by Larry Willis, who is President of the Transportation Trades Department at the AFL-CIO. And from government, we are pleased to welcome two leading lawmakers. Senator Tom Carper, Democrat of Maryland, who is ranking member of the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, the Senate's Chief Infrastructure Policy Committee, and Congressman Rodney Davis, a Republican of Illinois who serves on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and is a vocal advocate for bipartisan solutions to rebuild America's infrastructure. Last but certainly not least is today's moderator, NBC's Chuck Todd, who moderates Meet the Press and serves as the network's political director. Please join me in welcoming Chuck and our panelists to the stage.
Good morning, everybody.
Chuck, for the record.
Yeah, I know where you're going here. I was going to give Josh a hard time. There's a way to get...
Delmarva.
He's from the Delmarva Peninsula.
As opposed to Mar.
Yeah, the Delaware senator over there.
Ben Cardin and Chris Van Hollen will be interested in this development.
So, I'm just anxious to spend an hour talking about something that's not about the other story that we always talk about. So I'll set that aside. I'm struggling here, and Jamie, I'm going to start with you. I'm struggling here with this event because I don't feel as if there's disagreement. Meaning, everybody knows we have to do this. Everybody has been sounding this alarm in this town, I'd say at least 5 years, you could argue 10, since the bridge collapse in Minneapolis. And yet, there's this inertia. Now that you've been president of Business Roundtable for nearly a year now, what's your sense of why there's inertia on this?
Yeah. Well, you know, the political system has had gridlock. This is, as you said, Democrats, Republicans want it. It's really serious. And one of the reasons we even have this panel here is to try to start breaking down inertia. We all need it. It's hurting America. It's hurting jobs, wages, growth. We estimate by 0.2 or 3%. And it's so bad. I mean, we have 10% bridges now that are in the same state as that bridge in Minneapolis. I mean, it's a bad idea. It costs more money not to fix than to fix. Can you imagine that? And that's what we're doing as a nation, and we should do something about it. I'm glad everyone's up here because I think it shows you how serious it is.
Senator Carper, you're the senior-most lawmaker on here. You've been in this town longer than a lot of us. What's your explanation for the inertia? Because this is not something that should be polarizing. Everybody tells me left and right they want to see some infrastructure spending.
I think the key is leadership. I was governor for 8 years, 3 times I proposed that we raise the gas tax, gas and diesel tax, user fees. Transportation, roads, highways, bridges are historically funded through user fees. There's a reluctance on the other side to raise taxes or even user fees that are dedicated for roads, highways, and bridges. For many of our colleagues, if they vote to raise a user fee or a tax, they end up in a primary. And they get accused in a primary of being a tax and spend that kind of person. And that can actually bring them down in a primary. So there's a real reluctance to support revenues. Revenues isn't the entire answer. There's a lot of other things that are involved in this. But there's a reluctance in this country, certainly in the Congress, in the White House, for things that are worth having. Mm-hmm. There's not a willingness to pay for them.
Congressman Davis, fair?
Not completely.
Oh, come on.
I respect the opinion of my colleague, Senator Carper, but this is a bipartisan problem, Chuck. Mm-hmm. This is an issue that I came to Washington 5.5 years ago campaigning as a Republican on investing more in infrastructure. It wasn't necessarily the hotbed of Republican politics at the time, but what I found out when I got here is that we've got folks on my side. It doesn't matter what plan we put in place. If we charge $1 federal it's too much. Right. But conversely, on the other side, they're the never enough crowd. They will tell everybody who comes to see them who wants to invest in infrastructure, we're for this, we're for raising the gas tax, we're for bringing in electric vehicles into the mix, we're for doing asset recycling, we're for doing P3s, everything. But when you get a compromise together, those of us who can put together a 401k of funding sources, a good diversified portfolio, it's never going to be enough. So the key is, how do we get enough members, Chuck, that are going to be willing to take the political courage and vote to get a diversified portfolio of sources?
Larry Willis, you're representing labor here. It seems to me that you could bridge this, that you're the political actor here that could bridge that political divide there. Again, it's interesting. We easily just saw why there's gridlock here, even though there's agreement.
Well, that is what we try to do. And, you know, I think on this issue, I agree with both my friends here, right? That there is bipartisan support here. There's been some political headwinds to it, especially on the financing side. But, you know, we did a highway bill. It wasn't enough, but we did a $305 billion highway bill in 2015 that was very bipartisan, that Senator Carper and Congressman Davis and their colleagues worked on. And that's a good model of what we need to go moving forward. We need to pump a lot more money into it. But part of the problem is we're not talking about these issues in the right way. I mean, we really got to, you know, really narrow down to what this means for rank and file workers who aren't getting the jobs that we know are out there. We got to talk about what this means for commuters that, you know, have 3-hour commutes in some places, right. And it's ridiculous.
Brendan, you are a firm that gets plenty of international contracts. So give us a perspective of how behind we are on infrastructure right now as compared to the work your company is getting overseas.
Sure. So so just to kind of size the demand issue. So the American Society of Civil Engineers every 10 years or so puts out their report card on infrastructure. In 2017, they did the last update. As a nation, we received a D+ on an A to F scale. Their estimate, which is typically the most widely used, it's not where I went to school, but I don't know. They estimated the demand at roughly $2 trillion over the next 10 years, so $200 billion a year, to catch up to a B+, which would make us competitive and world-class from an infrastructure perspective. The same study pointed out that 9% of our bridges in the U.S. are structurally deficient today. So that's the scale of the challenge ahead of us. We don't really need to reinvent the wheel here. One of the things that we see when we both invest in projects and deliver projects around the world is that there's some real pockets of brilliance around how to bring public and private financing and funding together, newer ways of delivering and developing projects. Canada and Australia, I think, are two particularly strong examples from a public-private partnership P3 approach, as well as asset recycling, which could be two of the solutions here.
You didn't bring up China. It's interesting. That's obviously not an approach that we would want to copy, I imagine, as far as...
Yeah, so on China, I would say, because to me, this is fundamentally the core question about infrastructure is, do we want to invest in ourselves as a nation and get more competitive, or do we want to continue to muddle along and fall further behind? So some math here. China, over the last 10 years, has been spending roughly 9% of their gross domestic product investing in infrastructure. In the U.S., it's been less than 3%. Now, you have to be careful. Rapidly developing economy, more developed economy, you would expect to see differences, but 3x what we're investing here in the United States. It's no wonder that when you travel abroad, you can tell the difference, right, when you get off an airplane.
All right, Jamie, I found it interesting. We just heard why. To me, we heard why it can't pass. Is it really just a tax issue, or is there a way to break this down where we can start going at it so we can essentially compartmentalize your tax fight, right, on some of the user fee issues and begin the process?
There's two real things, okay? And the people here should know the reason we're doing this is so that we all get smarter. And when President Kennedy said we're going to put a man on the moon, 8 years later, a man was walking the moon. Now, when someone says we're going to build a bridge, 8 years later, you're still trying to get permits to build the bridge.
9.7 years later on average.
9.7 years on average.
Technically.
And we think it's funny that this takes place. It's a disgrace. And by the way, it doubles the cost, or maybe even triples the cost of the project. It's why people don't want to invest in it, because you're kind of tying your money in a certain thing. And we've got to fix the bureaucracy, the permitting, all the things that take place, and it's us. And it's got nothing to do with Democrats, Republicans. They should go fix that right now. And that's primary. The second is the funding, which obviously, when we're talking about bridges, tunnels, roads, airports, waterways, they're all a little bit different. I absolutely agree. User fees should be a big part of it. Financing would be a big part of it. But I have a different point of view. We should have a competitive tax structure, a competitive infrastructure, so help us God. That's what we should do. The notion that we're not going to have competitive things, it hurts growth probably by 0.5% a year or something like that. And then if we need to tax people, tax individuals more, including me if you have to. My view is to say we're going to accept bad infrastructure is bad for everybody. And it's going to damage us. It's hurting more and more over the years. And like you said, it's getting worse. It's not getting better.
Congressman Davis, what did President Trump make a mistake? Look, I'm going to preempt it. I believe President Trump made a mistake in not leading with infrastructure, not making it the first thing. It was when you come in as elected as a polarizing president, especially when you come in as a minority elected president with the minority vote, you immediately do what Josh Bolten's boss did, which is you call up Ted Kennedy, you do a bipartisan education bill very quickly, and you show, hey, I want to work with everybody. Infrastructure could have been that. You think we're going to look back and say, well, that was the miss moment?
Well, I'm already looking back saying that's the miss moment. And I don't blame the president or his administration at all. I think the strategy was laid out by the leadership in the House and the leadership in the Senate.
To go healthcare first?
Yes. Yeah. And the president himself made sure that infrastructure was put onto that schedule. And unfortunately, it became part of the discussion way too late, at a time when we're too polarized. And even when the president and his administration laid out his principles, they were ridiculed by many folks within the infrastructure industry, within the partisanship in Washington. Instead of looking at it like this is a chance to have an administration, we know this is their priority. Let's at least talk to them about actually getting these principles into legislation. But instead, it was blown up by the polarization of Washington, D.C., and not just in Congress, by also those who would invest in infrastructure.
Senator Carper, do you think a bunch of Democrats like yourself would have had an easier time supporting a President Trump initiative in the first 3 months of his administration?
Well, it's not too late. I'm going to leave here. I'm going to go to a hearing in the Committee on Environment and Public Works. We're going to be having a hearing with the focus on water resources development. And about 99% of all the stuff that comes into our ports in this country comes through waterways maintained by the Army Corps of Engineers. John Brasso, a Republican from Wyoming, and I have authored bipartisan legislation that focuses on the water side, ports, rivers, dams, and so forth. And we have bipartisan support. We have almost unanimous support. We'll report a bill out of committee next week. And my hope is that the example that we set will speak to the White House, will speak to other committees in the House and Senate and say, well, if those guys can do this and find unanimity on at least the water infrastructure piece, maybe we can find some common ground on other areas too.
Larry, how important, though, is it to create a public, do you think that obviously more public pressure would help here, but it is hard to get Americans fired up about infrastructure? Well, your members are probably fired up about it because they see wages and jobs.
I mean, I think from a labor perspective, there's sort of two things going on. I mean, one is that even though you have a lower unemployment rate than we've recently seen in the past, we know there's still a lot of good jobs that we're not taking advantage of here. And what's great about investing in transportation and infrastructure more broadly is that when you combine it with good federal labor policies, Buy America rules, you're investing in sectors that, quite frankly, have higher union density than a lot of other parts of the economy. You are creating really good jobs, not only on the construction side, but on the good operating jobs that you leave behind, whether you're talking about transit or ports or airports or whatever. So I think we need to talk, again, more about the immediate jobs that we're going to create, the good jobs that we're going to leave behind. And as I mentioned earlier, you have too many people in this country that face just killer commutes, both from a public transit perspective and from a roads perspective. And we have jobs that are being created, but too often, especially in city centers, they don't have access to whether it's public transportation or a road network that works for them. And we need to fix that if we're going to grow our economy. I think we need to start talking again. The studies and the number of bridges is important, and we should continue to do that. But what it means for rank and file workers and commuters is something we need to do more of.
There's another part of this inertia that I want to address here, which is we never say when we should no longer invest in an infrastructure project, okay? I don't think anybody, at one point railroads seemed to be the the thing we should expand the most. Then it became the interstate highway system. You can make an argument if we're about to go to automated drivers in the next 50 years, do we need, what do we need of infrastructure that we need to start experimenting with, and what do we need to creatively destruct and not restore?
Yeah, Chuck, I would say, so I think that's a key question. So when we talk about renewing America's infrastructure, I think a key part of that needs to be getting really clear about what infrastructure we're renewing and what new next generation infrastructure we're building. And you're seeing discussions about this in the states and cities that are frankly not waiting for help and are choosing in some cases as the users and beneficiaries of this infrastructure. So Measure M in Los Angeles, the $54 billion plan that was passed in Seattle in 2016, some of these cities and regions took matters into their own hands. And in Los Angeles, the voters decided to raise sales taxes on themselves by 0.5%. And it was really interesting. The polling demonstrated that when they were making that decision in the ballot box, it wasn't driven by the cost to me today. They were thinking about, I want better infrastructure a generation and 2 generations from now for my grandchildren. And people were willing to invest in that so long as they knew that their tax dollars would be invested in their local community. And of course, what that's going to do is it's going to make those local regions, right? We're talking about competitiveness both at the national scale and at the local scale. Think about Amazon's HQ2 decision. In their RFP, they explicitly called out the quality of local infrastructure as a prerequisite for, as an evaluation criteria. So states and cities now, I think, are going to increasingly become the driver in terms of how we think about infrastructure. Are we just going to deal with what we've got today, or are we going to be thinking forward about what the roads of the future need to look like of autonomous vehicles?
And the reason I asked that, Jamie, is that you keep bringing up the moon. What's interesting about the moon is that it's not just that we got there in 8 years, it's all the residual that came with it, right? And there's something to be said if we say, okay, so I think about what Elon Musk wants to do, this Hyperloop thing. And on one hand, you think, oh, it's crazy, digging a tunnel from Washington that potentially gets you to New York. But somebody might have said the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System in 1930, if they would have been told about it, would have seemed crazy too. How much of our infrastructure investment should be on the future versus the repairs of today?
Well, it should be both, and you've got to do one by one, and there's no easy, quick answer for that. I think there's this issue which you said about local. There are a lot of local people who are doing great stuff. Boston did the Big Dig, which I believe you guys did, and if you go to Boston today, it's booming partially because it's easy to get around. They can build
that infrastructure project, was it 1 generation or 2 generations that it took? I mean, it's both an example of when it's built, it's great. Right. But is it already outdated?
The point I was going to make is I think one of the things the American public sees, they want to know, like you said, that it's going to be good right here and that it's real. They're always afraid when it's taxes on Americans that goes to Washington, it's that great sucking sound, and it's going to go to pay special interest groups and not accomplish what it was set to do. So I think one of the things that Washington needs to do is say, this is earmarked for that specific thing, and we're going to track, measure it, and evaluate ourselves, just like we evaluate companies and anything else.
Can I just tie together Jamie's comment and something that Senator Carper talked about before, which is inland waterways. So that's a great example here because you have the primary beneficiaries of the inland waterways system, the freight and barging industry, who has gotten together and said, as the primary beneficiaries, we are happy to pay increased user fees so long as we're guaranteed that those user fees will be reinvested in this specific infrastructure. So I actually think it's one of the leading examples where you've got bipartisan support, you've got users who are happy to shoulder their fair share of the cost.
I want you both to address this. It's interesting. The mayor of Oklahoma City, who I think is now running for governor of Oklahoma, but the mayor of Oklahoma City, I remember telling me he was a Republican who raised taxes. And he said, but he had the sales tax was going to a specific, and they did it, and they used it, and we'll see how he handles the primary, and we'll see if he can survive a primary for being a mayor that raised a tax. But it does seem to be that if you do specify it, does the federal government need to rethink how it tells the public how a fee is used?
I served as governor for 8 years, 93 to 2001. 3 times I asked for increases in the gas and diesel taxes, successful one time. But if you look in the last 3 or 4 years, something like 30 states have voted to increase their user fees. And the legislators, Republican legislators who voted to do that in 30 states, 95% of them got reelected. The Democrats who voted to do that in 30 states, 90% of them got reelected. And they actually did better than the folks who voted not to do that. Where we're going, though, in the future I think for funding our roads, highways, bridges, is not necessarily a gas and diesel tax. The president invited a bunch of auto manufacturers to the White House last Friday. And one of the things he talked about was what we needed to do in the government to help facilitate their success. And one of the things that they called for was, they said, we're going to compete in the world with ever more energy efficient vehicles, clean burning, economic, environmentally friendly vehicles. And what we need is help on fueling stations for hydrogen. What we need are charging stations across the country, and for the federal government to provide a tax code and some grants that actually facilitate that. What we need to do is to get prepared for the day when we don't have so many new cars and trucks and vans that are being created that use gas or diesel, gasoline and diesel. Right. But we need a vehicle miles traveled approach, so that by 2030, whenever somebody's going, I don't care if they're using a diesel or gasoline-powered vehicle, they're going to pay something. If they're electric-powered or they're fuel cell-powered, they're going to be paying something and a tax, direct or indirect tax, to fund the construction and maintenance of our infrastructure. That's where we're going. And the question is, what do you do in the meantime, right, between now and the time we have the vehicle miles traveled system in place?
Congressman Davis, how do you sell this to the skeptical voter who just thinks, oh, my money just disappears? Is this specificity way to go, the way to keep Grover Norquist off your back? You know?
Listen, Grover's a friend. I'm not worried about Grover. But I want to go back to something Mr. Bechtel said. And Mr. Carper said. Senator Carper talks about water infrastructure, inland waterway system. I represent an area that butts up to the Mississippi River. I've heard for 20 years how the Corps of Engineers was going to use those inland waterway user fund fees to upgrade our navigation system. And you know what we've seen in 20 years? Nothing. We still have. We can.
You know why? That's what I mean. What is the answer to that?
A lot of it has to do with what Jamie talked about, and that's the inefficiencies of the existing bureaucracy and how it's set up to disperse those funds. Maybe we need to make some changes on how those funds are being dispersed, because that inland waterway user fee that was voluntarily increased in a bipartisan way is now sitting there in surplus measures because the agency that is in charge of actually doling those dollars out and showing the American people those infrastructure improvements is way behind in making that happen. That is part of the problem that Senator Carper and we, under the leadership of Chairman Schuster and Chairman Graves, we're working on that water infrastructure bill. We've got to work together to make these agencies work better to get the funds out. Think about the future of how to fund our infrastructure. Instead of looking at it as just the gas tax and the diesel tax and the user fee system that we have now, we have to realize that's going down. Even if we raised the gas tax and diesel tax, the revenues would come down because of electric vehicles, because of hydrogen power cells, because of where we see our future transportation needs. We need to look at making sure we create a 401k for our infrastructure user fees so that it's less volatile. When you have more electric vehicles on the road, that will be more of the pie in the user fee system.
Larry, I feel like, go ahead, because I feel like you guys are making the case of why we should go to the states with this. Yeah, and just ask for a chunk of money from you guys.
You know, every year we adopted an operating budget. Every year we adopted a capital budget. When legislators wanted to get a road, highway, bridge project in the capital budget, we said, "Are you willing to help support revenues?" If they weren't, their project was not likely to make it into the budget. And but then a state legislator, if they voted for some revenues, could go back to their districts and say, "See this intersection improvement, this bridge, whatever was going on in their district. The reason why I voted to provide those revenues was to get this project done." Earmarks. We don't have that anymore in the United States Congress. And the question is, can we have a form of earmarks that is actually ethically sound and
more like a tax receipt, I would call it, or an appropriations receipt for the voters.
Is it possible to have earmarks without the kind of abuses that we saw come into play? I think it is.
Larry, have you noticed is labor noticed that projects get started faster if they're a state or a city funded project versus a federal project?
Well, look, obviously, states always have an important role to play here, and they're having a more important role.
No, but are they doing it faster? Are they able? Is their procurement or process or their approval process much faster?
Well, I think it really depends on state and what type of project that you're talking about. And everyone on this panel is right. There are federal permitting and some regulatory issues that need to be changed to sort of streamline those projects, and we've been supportive of that. But I don't think it takes away from the underlying problem that the big issue here is the money, right? And you can talk about sort of the public-private partnerships. The reality is those are only sort of suitable for a real minority of projects out there and of our needs on the infrastructure system. We really need a federal commitment here, and that's sort of what's been missing.
Would you accept?
I'm getting the hook to go join my colleagues in the Environment Public Works Committee so we can actually have a hearing on water infrastructure and make some progress. Can I just mention one thing before they pull me out of here? First of all, thank you for doing this. This is hugely important. And thank you for providing leadership, Jamie, to focus and refocus our attention. Leadership's always the key to the success of any organization I've ever been a part of. We need great leadership. And we need consistent leadership. The president hosted about 8 of our colleagues, 2 months ago to focus on the infrastructure, what we needed to do. It started off really well. And he asked me, he said, what do you think we need to do, Tom? And I said, we need to sort of like reestablish the purchasing power of the user fees and eventually migrate to a vehicle miles traveled approach. And I said, George Winovich and I proposed 4 cent a year increase in gas and diesel tax for 4 years and then index it going forward until we're ready to do vehicle miles traveled. And he said 4 cents is not enough. And then he said like, it's got to be at least 25 cents. Yeah. And the Republican colleagues that are in the room, they're like, their jaws dropped to the table. And he said, it's got to be 25 cents. It's got to be 25 cents right now. And he said, I will provide the air cover, the political cover. I know it's a hard thing to do, but that's what we need to do. That night, I called, and he came back to that again and again and again during the hour-long meeting. That night, I called Elaine Chao, who was sitting next to me at the meeting, our Secretary of Transportation, and said, was he serious? And she says, he's been talking about it for weeks. But you know what? He's not talking about it since then. Right. And there's other things, other distractions and so forth as well. Part of what we need to do is permitting reform. Part of it is like public-private partnerships. We've done 60 of them in the last 30 years. That's not the only answer. But part of it is migrating to a vehicle miles traveled approach. And in the meantime, how are we going to fill the bucket in terms of funds? And that's sort of the challenge. And thank you so much for giving us an opportunity to share our thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate all the great things you're doing. Two things that are on my mind is listening to this. Accounting. It's arcane. My partner, Josh Bolton, knows very well OMB, but treating capital expenditures like expenditures is insane. And if any company did that, they wouldn't survive very long if you're not maintaining your airplane or buying new equipment and stuff like that. And the second one is transparency, which is the government, I think there are 60,000 bridges in America. What you are entitled to have is every single one, how it's evaluated, is it doing well, is it being repaired, is it being fixed, where's the money going? So government transparency itself, reduces people's confidence in all the things we're doing in government. Lack of transparency.
I want to go back to a point that actually Senator Carper, and then I'm going to open it up to a couple questions here, which is, there's one easy way to get this on the top of the agenda. No president in my lifetime knows how to use the bully pulpit like this one when he wants to. And you can, and if there are moments that I hear all the time about where his head is. He wants to do this. He wants to be the guy that does this. Why is he hesitating, Congressman, to suddenly champion it again? It seems to be, this would be sort of you're in the middle of a storm and he's got Russia, I get it. This would be something to grab onto that might get bipartisan support.
I'd certainly hope it would get bipartisan support, but I don't share your optimism in that. Again, I go back to the too much and the never enough issue. The president clearly wants to invest in infrastructure. I don't think there's the appetite on either side and either leadership table to actually come up with a compromise that's going to get those votes.
But if he keeps selling it, and almost browbeating you guys, in the way when he browbeats. I mean, we saw he can browbeat with the best of them.
Well, there are some that I think would respond to that browbeating, and there are others that may not be in my party that would clearly enjoy being on the other side of any issue. I mean, we're seeing this right now. We could invest in infrastructure. We could create a user fee system that is diversified, that is less volatile, that will have the investments that we want, but we still have a workforce problem, Chuck. We've got 9 million more people on food stamps today when unemployment is at 3.9% than when it was at 9.5% 10 years ago. And we're trying to work a system where we're investing $1 billion a year to get people who are on SNAP benefits, food stamps, paired up to go into training programs like Larry's unions offer, to get paired up with job opportunities. And you know how many Democratic votes that we got on the House Agriculture Committee for investing $1 billion a year in that, pairing people up with job opportunities? Zero. Well, so there is a distinct problem here because of the polarization, because of where we are with the election cycle, and I just don't think you could get anybody to come along to give the president this victory that they know he wants right now.
All right, it sounds like they should just hand some cash to the states and let the states do it. What do you guys think? I have to say, that's what I keep hearing. No offense to the Washington, but I keep hearing, take the $200 billion, hand it to the states, and let them figure this out.
So, Chuck, I can offer perspective from other parts of the world, maybe. Yeah. So I think that Canada is an interesting case study for this. So in Canada, they've created a sort of default approach to these infrastructure projects where typically you'll see something like a 50-50 federal-provincial split on funding, but the provinces tend to drive it. If it's an urban project, you'll see a third, a third, a third. The reality is that the primary benefits of most infrastructure projects are going to be felt locally. Sure. And the people in that community are going to be the most invested in a good project outcome that's good for the taxpayers, that provides the benefits that you want from that infrastructure. So I do think there's something to be said for paying attention to these localized movements to sort of be masters of their own destiny here with respect to their infrastructure. Now, the role of the federal government, there are members of the administration who for over a year now have been pointing out that, the federal government only owns 7% of public infrastructure. It funds something like 16%, and it permits 100%, right? So there you go. One of the first things that's happening is trying to right-size that permitting process that we talked about. Look, the environmental impact statement permitting process is an incredibly important process. We need to protect the environment. We need to have consultations with communities, but let's do that once. Let's do that in an integrated way. Let's not do it in series where every time you got to reopen the consultation and go back to court to decide whether or not you want to put in a carbon neutral light rail transit system in your community that your community people want to pay for. So I think there's been some good progress on that. We need the legislation side to catch up with the rulemaking side.
And let me open it up to some questions. No, come on. Really? Not one? There we go. In the back. I think they got microphones.
You guys are talking a lot about giving the money to the states and letting local communities handle that. How would you say that we should approach that to ensure that we don't exacerbate the divide between wealthy, prospering cities and rural communities that are finding themselves left behind?
That's a good one. I'll let the politician start first. Congressman?
Thank you, Chuck. I appreciate that.
Hey, you're the one that wants to be elected.
And I'm the one that represents one of those districts. I represent a rural district. That's why the VMT concerns me. We don't have a lot of options for the single moms in my district to get to work, and they have to drive 30 miles each way to get there. These are concerns that we continue to have. Many states are different than others. Many states are more functional at investing in their infrastructure, and then you have states like Illinois that aren't. And these are the types of debates that we have to have, but we also have to ensure that it's not just a discussion about the existing status quo, shoving more money into the system, because many times it's not about just investing dollars, it's about the regulatory relief. And one thing, Mr. Bechtel, I wanted to mention, when I got here with our water infrastructure bill 4.5 years ago, we actually reduced what I consider the paperwork process for water infrastructure projects from an average of 15 years. Now we say that to the Corps of Engineers, you got to get it done in 3. But that doesn't translate into our highway infrastructure as well, our rail infrastructure as well. And we've got to do a better job of making sure that those regulatory requirements are reduced so that our projects can move forward. And I can give you example after example, even in rural areas like mine, where that bureaucracy is slowing down progress, and in the end, thus costing many more dollars to actually implement.
Larry, you wanted to jump in on it.
Yeah, we have to have a national transportation network here, right? And the federal government needs to lead on that. Again, states can and should have a role here, but we need to make sure that we have a transportation system that's interconnected and that we don't have sort of winners and losers based on, geography or, what states are richer or what have you. So and I love Rodney Davis, but I think he's a little of a pessimist here on the bipartisanship here. I do think on infrastructure and transportation, there is still room for Democrats, for Republicans to come together on this. His committee on the floor just passed an aviation reauthorization bill with like 300-something votes. I mean, it was
infrastructure.
And it was infrastructure, and it was a good bill. And from a labor perspective, we will go and talk to Democrats to get behind good bills. We're not going to tell them to get behind bad bills just because we're going to, try to give someone a victory. But if it's a good bipartisan bill, we will go work that like we did on the FAST Act, like we've done on the water bills in the past, like we did on FAA. So I think there is some room for bipartisan work at the federal level.
I hope you're right.
Yes, sir.
Good morning. My name is Augustine Cruz. I'm with Silverline Communications. I have a question, probably more for Mr. Dimon and Mr. Bechtel. Somebody on the panel earlier was citing some local examples, I think out in California, that were doing a particularly good job. I'd love to know from your perspective, what other states, localities have you seen in the last 5-6 years who are doing a really bang-up job, who've said to the federal government, we're going at this alone, and are using either public-private partnerships, raising taxes, user fees, and I'd be particularly interested in any localities that might be more conservative and have historically been against raising taxes or fees. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll go first, and Jamie or others can pile on. I would say some states that come to mind is over the last 5 to 10 years being more innovative and thinking about how to meet their infrastructure needs in creative ways. I think Virginia and what has been known as the hot lanes, for those of you that live here in the area, is a pretty good example. And it's one where they've tried to effectively balance the needs of rural and more urban or suburban users. I think that California, particularly Southern California, has been a leading example more at a regional level, urban level. I think Florida and Colorado have also gotten pretty innovative with how they think about unleashing this. There's $150 billion estimated of dry powder of capital, waiting, private capital in the form of institutional investor money that is looking for long-lived assets to match the tenure of their payouts, that wants to flow into these projects. And only 2/3 of the states in the US have a P3 policy framework that enables you to do that. 1/3 of the states don't even have a way for the private sector to invest in these public infrastructure projects. Then the next step, in my view, would then be, and some of these states that I talked about are good examples where they've been working, there's an effort that has been underway in the Pacific Northwest to harmonize some of these rules for how you participate in P3s, which is, again, another example where Australia and Canada stand out to me. You need to create a robust pipeline of P3 projects with similar rules each time to decrease the transaction costs for investors. And then it gets really exciting. And then companies like Bechtel or like a big bank or a pension fund are going to get excited about investing and getting ready to do multiple projects in an area. So those are a couple of states that come to mind.
I would just add, not New York City. Okay, which hasn't built a bridge or a railroad. We've got problems with the subways, we've got problems then. But Texas would be a great example, very pro-business, and they work together to get the infrastructure, the buildings, the schools, in an integrated kind of way. So they are really successful getting businesses to move there.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for the excellent discussion. I'm Eagles Milbergs. I'm co-founder of a nonprofit in Seattle that helps water entrepreneurs get off the ground. My question is about infrastructure, not making it great again, but making it greater. And through innovation and creativity, our entrepreneurs in this field are just starting to boom all over the country. And it seems to me that I'm wondering about your ideas about how we can engage the entrepreneurial community, our universities, partnerships between companies and universities to take advantage of the creative talent we have so that the infrastructure that we build for the future really does represent cutting-edge technology and isn't just rebuilding the past.
Jamie, you want to take that?
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, we already have tons of innovation sitting on the table right now. New ways of doing things. Like the FAA, the rest of the world is on a modern air traffic control system, which I am told will reduce the average flight time by 20 minutes and the average CO2 by 20%. We simply haven't put it in place because there's some debate about public and private, there's some debate about how it's going to get paid for, there's some debate about private companies and public companies. So our inability isn't that we don't have innovation. These guys built amazing things today which are built very differently than they were built 20 or 30 years ago. So I think we have it. We've just crippled ourselves with red tape.
And if you don't mind me adding to this, Jamie, you're 100% correct. The air traffic control new wave system that we wanted to help implement that was not new to Canada and not new to other countries had to be stripped out of that FAA bill that then became bipartisan. That's the partisanship that I'm talking about here that I think stifles innovation, not just in Congress, but also within the agencies that have not lived up to the investments of historic amounts of tax dollars into new systems that never get implemented. That's something that we're trying to fight every single day in Congress. And it gets frustrating because we want to do exactly what Jamie said, innovate. But we find ourselves fighting to make sure that those new innovations are given an opportunity to even compete, let alone be a part of our infrastructure system.
Larry, you're in the role of responding to some of these issues about regulation and stuff. What are some red tape things that you think you could convince Democrats to agree that it needs to be streamlined?
Well, as I said, we agree that, so a lot of these projects take too long to get completed. It's costing us jobs on the construction side, and it's costing us jobs in terms of the operating employees that are ready to go to work. I will say I think Congress has already done a lot of that, both in the FAST Act and some other bills, and it needs to be implemented at the federal level. And again, I think there should be some focus on that, but I don't think it should distract us from the real funding issues that we need to confront here. I think it's too easy to say, well, these projects take too long, but then not really let policymakers off the hook to find the answers of the real issue, which I think is the funding.
All right. I go back to something that we heard here. There's no shortage of ideas. There's no shortage of identifying the problems, surfacing the issues. Jamie, you any more optimistic or less optimistic?
I'm the same. I wake up every morning, folks, I give it my best. I put the jersey on and go full speed at it, and that's what we should do as leaders of America. That's what people expect us to do, and if we fail, so be it. Get up and give it your best. And then you all, the public, should say, I'm not going to take this stuff anymore. Because every one of you would vote for that FAA thing if you can save 20 minutes for flight time and save 20% of CO2. Every one of you. So your leaders are failing you, basically.
Jamie, can I just pile on and say the time to act is now? This problem gets harder to solve and more expensive to solve with every day that goes by. So inaction is tantamount to deciding that we're going to saddle future generations with an even harder and more expensive and less safe solution than dealing with the hard problem now.
And it's cheaper to fix than it is not to fix. Just keep that in mind. It's costing more money because it's bad than it would cost if we simply spent the money to fix it.
It's like having compounding interest in your bank account, but in the wrong direction.
Right, exactly.
You got that, right?
I got that.
Okay.
I understand that.
Yeah.
Is that how banking works? Yeah.
I'm just a construction guy.
Fair enough. All right, guys. I don't know if I'm as optimistic, but anyway, I'm closer to where Congressman Davis is. I've watched this town work too long to know how easy it is to kill something. It's much easier to kill a project than it is to fund one.
It is, but let me say something real quick, Chuck. I know we're out of time, but you know what? It helps energize me as a policymaker to know that we've got the people in this room, the people at this table that want us to continue to push forward to solutions. Regardless of the polarization, there are a lot of us in Washington on both sides of the aisle that really want to see good progress made. We've made good progress in the past, working together side by side, but we've got to do a better job in this environment.
So is that pessimistic optimism or optimistic pessimism?
Something.
There you go. Anyway, thank you very much, guys.
Good to see you, my friend.
Thank you.
Well done. I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming in. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really
Thank you,
appreciate it.
guys.
Spend your
Yeah.
time.